I'm from the Historical Thesaurus project at Glasgow, which produced the Historical Thesaurus of English, which then became the Historical Thesaurus of the OED in a sort of sub-licensed form to OUP, and it's great to be here for this. Unsurprisingly, given that background, I'm going to talk about using the thesaurus, and in particular this idea of linking meanings and words together. We've been talking a lot, I always get interested in this. We've been talking a lot about words already today, but whenever people have said words, almost always they've meant meanings. It's really our senses. Very rarely has someone said, we want to find out about this word, and they're happy to have all the senses indicated by that word form compressed together. I noticed that a lot in the digital humanities, the big data session earlier this morning, where let's look at the rise and fall of this word, and actually they were thinking of the rise and fall of the thing which this word refers to, its meaning. And that gets really interesting when you look at stuff with the thesaurus. I mean, words themselves, no one really cares about that much. It's quite sad. People in this room do, we do, but lexicologists always find that people don't actually give a toss about words. They actually care about meanings quite a lot. To be honest, if something happens in this room or in this hotel in the next couple of hours, then the number of people in the world who actually care about words as words is annihilated. It's going to be terrible. So, talking about these things and getting away from words as the sort of bastard proxy for meanings, which they usually are, would be kind of one of the things I'm going to talk about. So, there are three things I was going to talk about. Firstly was briefly to talk about the tyranny of the alphabet, which the OED could kind of stop being so beholden to, and already it has been to quite an extent. Secondly, to talk about tagging sources with meanings, which aids with quite a lot of the kind of work we're talking about in DH and the rest. And then finally, to visually expose, or explore, if you don't like the word expose, the OED. When it comes to the first one of these, ending the tyranny of the alphabet, we heard this morning from Tim about how the OED is no longer revising in alphabetical order, which is great because there's no point to the alphabet, really. It's very difficult to get away from the alphabet with dictionaries. The OED's own definition of a dictionary mentions alphabetical order. But really, nowadays, there's no point to alphabetical order. It's kind of antiquated and it's kind of irritating. It does quite a few things. Most of us in this room have probably talked about alphabetical order or taught about it. And there are two quotes we always use. The first one is Coleridge, who talks about the accident of initial letters and as a structuring mechanism for an encyclopedia he was wanting to create, I think. And then secondly, and everyone gets this one, the very lengthy and pained attempts of Cawdrey to explain what alphabetical order is. And there's some brilliant examples of this. Every time someone thinks they've reinvented alphabetical order, Balbus does this too. They sort of go into this incredibly long explanation of how is it. And Balbus ends with this kind of plea saying, please don't think this is worthless. And I feel slightly bad in saying, well, alphabetical order is worthless. To be honest, it places unrelated items next to each other. It loses the opportunity to make useful links in various bits of meaning, and it does quite a few other things. It prohibits easy browsing, which I'll talk about at the end of what I was going to say, and it hinders seeing the opposition of near synonyms. People who were at Dirk Hierarch's talk earlier on will recognise this sort of structural semantic notion. So to get rid of alphabetical order, and we heard about some of the ways that OED was working with non-alphabetical order this morning, so it was things like, let's look at the most common words. But I also think that, firstly, the OED can get rid of this metaphor of alphabetical order that goes down the right-hand side of every page. Or is it the left-hand side nowadays? Somewhere on every OED search page or on the OED definition bit, you get lists of nearby words according to their alphabetical order highlighted. And that's kind of a useless metaphor nowadays, unless it so happens that the initial morpheme of the word you're looking at is the main meaning-bearing morpheme of that word. Alphabetical order is at worst useless and at best misleading. So, arranging things instead semantically, as the OED can do with the data it has, is a more useful way of arranging these things and finding out more stuff that goes on. What I then want to really argue after this, at this bit, is that now the OED can then integrate meaning more closely into what it does. It can begin to tag its sources with individual meanings, so that one can search through corpora and its other various databases, not by word but by meaning instead. This is entirely doable with the HTOED data, because the HTOED is itself hierarchical. If you take a corpus source, for example, and then you tag it with all the words which are monosemous, then you build up a semantic profile of the environment of that text. You build up a semantic profile of what's going on in the neighbourhood of any polysemous words. This, I just had to have a graph to kind of, you know, I'm a linguist, please take me seriously. Shows you kind of just how many words are monosemous in English. It's one of these kind of Hyper-Zipfian distributions. It's fairly standard. And we have most of English being monosemous. And in that case, we can then take words which are very difficult to the kind of run, set, strike, the words which, in common with a few other people, I'm reluctant to even see those as verbs anymore. They're just sort of quasi-prepositional units. And then finding out where something is, finding out what meaning a word has, is a matter of looking at the nearby words, the semantic neighbourhood, and finding the distance between the candidate meanings of a word and whereabouts else. The candidate meanings of a word and its environment. So as a very brief example, if you have something beat up, I just chose this randomly from the OED yesterday morning, then there are three meanings. First one is to strike a person. So if you have beat up ambiguously in a text, you can then look nearby for anything near that thesaurus reference code. And this one, we've got 10508 to 802. It's just one level away from the target meaning, and that's a good indicator that we can then say in this source text, that sense of beat up or beaten up is that particular 10508 sense. Enlist soldiers, similarly, collocates with things like battle, and those collocates tell you that nearby, that's that meaning. You can attack it that way, and so on and so forth. So in these senses, you can then begin to abandon the idea of searching sources for words and instead start searching sources for meanings. Obviously, this speeds up the process of looking through text, finding extra candidate examples, but it also opens up more interesting possibilities. For example, if you have a very large corpus of historical English, as the OED does and as other people do, including Mark, then when you have that with a semantic tag, you can begin to present to users examples from your corpus automatically, which are going to be the right sense. That's going to be annoying. That's why we can't do much with corpora and without a sort of intervention from human beings with the OED, because there's no point in saying to someone, oh, you're looking up run, you know, sense 3, subsense 25. Here, click this button, and we'll just give you lots of examples of the word run used in any form, possibly to mean anything, just as a list. Thank you. No, instead it'd be more useful to do that semantically. As well as that, you can then start to look for more interesting patterns. Hurst patterns, those patterns which indicate nearby definitions, are quite useful. If you have the ability to locate meanings in a text, then you have the ability to locate definitions in a text. And being able to present to users contemporaneous definitions from text, unself-conscious definitions, instances of, for example, when someone says, I'm going to, you know, pick up my handbag, which is a type of bag. Those sort of patterns, those kind of textual indicators that nearby is a definition can then be raised to the surface. And it'd be very useful for users, I think, to be able to find definitions which are contemporaneous with the period they're interested in. Whether or not they're accurate or true is a very different matter, and that's why we still need the OED definition patterns. As well as this, semantically tagged texts are also useful services to just the wider community. It's interesting to be able to annotate and to be able to aggregate what's going on in text by their meanings rather than by their words. All right, let's say we've done this, and you've got all sorts of interesting things. The final thing I was going to say was another advantage of integrating more closely meanings rather than words to the heart of the OED is that you can start to visualize the data. James is talking about this in about 10 minutes in another room, but the doors are locked here, stuck here, so I'm just going to show you some stuff. And what's going on here is when you arrange things by their initial letter, you can't really visualize them very well because there's no structuring principle that makes sense going on behind that. Instead, and this leads up to kind of the handout you've been given, if you have something like this, let's say these 8 words to do with vocabulary, with their various dates of usage, this is from the print HTOED, you can then do some interesting stuff with it. You can take these words, put them into a table. You can take the table and then you can colour it. I've coloured this one, just an example, by the first cited date. So if it's cited quite recently, it's yellow. Cited a long time ago, it's black. Just an example. Okay, that's fair enough for something like this. You can then see that most of the words we have in English for vocabulary are fairly recent. That's not desperately exciting, but you can do it for larger scales. So this one here, mustard, again, is more recent. and black is more distant. This is 430 words, so it's a way of exploring words and phrases. That's our original category there in blue. I'll go back once more again. This is about 7,000 words, all the words meaning a study of language. And you can see again a pattern of this. Study of language is quite a mustardy category. It's quite early in its own one. So you can browse these sorts of sections more easily visually than you can browsing, for example, a list of things by the alphabet. At this stage, I'm going to get rid of the words on top of those little blocks because they don't really mean anything. You can even see them when you're here, let alone when you're there. And you can go back further and further again to larger and larger categories until you get to something like this, and this is on your handout. This is modern English in the OED. All of modern English arranged by their meanings. And every dot of ink, or every pixel, if you prefer, is a word, and there are about 470,000 of them in modern English. And rather than them just being sort of listed for you, or proportions or pie charts saying this is how many are of these ones, or of these dates, here you have them arranged by their meaning, so that it makes kind of sense for you to look at them and see, for example, that physics and chemistry are very bright because they're more recent than other sections. That's not really controversial. Physics is a more recent field than warfare. But nonetheless, there's some other really interesting effects. You get little dark clusters there in number, because those are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cardinal numbers. You get all sorts of other things where if you present, not necessarily saying this exact idea, but present something like this, present the OED to people visually and allow them to navigate it, to drill down, to drill backwards, to go up, down, left, right, side to side and back in time. To do all of these things in a way which makes sense to them and which brings back what we lost when we didn't really bother with printed dictionaries, the ability to just flick around and be bored and to find nearby things. That's one thing which I really miss. I think Philip Pullman yesterday was talking about Brewers. I mean, I would hate to have an electronic version of Brewers. I don't know what I would do with an electronic version of Brewers. The point of Brewers is to pick it up and then flick through it and then sort of stop doing anything else for 4 or 5 hours. So you have this kind of, instead, an exploratory possibility when you're dealing with these kind of ones. It also tells you some other things about the history of English and some other ways of presenting to the public some data that's locked in the OED. Here we have this very weird patchwork effect, lots of bright bits next to lots of not so bright bits. This patchwork effect is almost unique to English in this period, and that's because of the various revolutions that happened, the Industrial Revolution and the Digital Revolution in recent years. If I go back and show you instead English in the age of Samuel Johnson, then you have very much unmixed effect. You don't get anywhere near that patchwork. And it's not just unique to Johnson. You go back to Shakespeare, you get a very mixed effect. You go back to Chaucer, you get a very mixed effect. So in all these circumstances, you can take slices of OED data and display them visually to show a browsability and a different way of looking at this information. You don't have to colour it by date, by the way. I just want to colour it by date. Colour it by part of speech. And you find those areas in English which dominate with verbs rather than nouns, or those areas which dominate with prepositions. They're weird areas. You can also colour them by all sorts of other things, by language of origin. For example, is a really interesting area. You get action in the bottom left-hand corner of your handout. Action, which is quite dark. Action is really, really Anglo-Saxon. Whereas, amazingly enough, physics and computing, no, not so much. You can also look at other things. You can show proportional sizes of vocabulary. I showed you these 4 pictures side by side as if they were the same size. They're not the same size, they're this size. You can do all sorts of other things once you arrange them in this way. And that's because semantic order makes sense to people and it makes them able to explore things a bit better. Finally, you can also see some weirdnesses in our data and weirdnesses in the OED. This is terms of endearment, 02, 02, 02, subcategory 4 in HTOED. It is vomitous. It is really, really, really horrible to look at terms of endearment. These are the terms which, you know, people have been using to refer to their loved ones. And they are just, I always think they kind of tell you a bit more about Murray and Bradley and Craigie and onions than they do about anything else. So words like my Piccadilly, my ding-dong, my bag pudding. Try and use any of these words at a disco on a Friday night and see what happens. But you can see here, it's really biased towards modern words. We have lots of modern words for terms of endearment. We don't have that many historical words. That's not because in Middle English no one was affectionate, of course they were. It's because we just don't have very good data sources for this kind of thing. But they are out there. While we don't have very good data sources for Middle English terms of affection, they do indicate, this kind of thing does indicate there are areas where we need to go and look for them more, We need to go and find areas where we think there might be terms of affection in Middle English, and there are still letters, there are still other items, and find them and bring them back into the OED. We can see the deficiencies in our data as well as the deficiencies in our language. And I think that's very useful. And that's really where I'm so reluctant to end on this slide. If anyone's terribly bored, let me know and I will send them an image of the thesaurus page which just has these words. They're the best emetic I have ever found. They really kind of, and if you really want to imagine some of your favourite OED editors kind of reading them out and kind of, talking about them and deciding how to define them, it really kind of puts them in a very different light. So that's all I want to say for what's here. And thank you very much for your time.
Okay, and our next speaker is David Crystal.
Right, well, this follows on very much from what Mark has just been talking about. I've been working with the thesaurus for quite a while now for a forthcoming book for OUP, which is mentioned in the first item on the handout here. What I did was I examined, they asked me basically to provide a kind of general introduction to HTOED. So what I did was I examined 15 semantic fields within the HTOED taxonomy. Now, the aim of the book is to introduce the general reader to the wealth of data that's in the thesaurus. But during the course of the work, a number of issues arose which I think need to be addressed in long-term planning, most of which are to do with the interaction between the notions of taxonomy, semantic field, and etymology. The point is, you see, that the HTOED has come in with the OED a few years ago. End of story? No, beginning of story, because of course everything that's going to happen to the OED that we've been talking about in other sessions is going to have to be integrated within the thesaurus conceptualization that we've just been talking about. Yes, of course it's going to have to be. So any problems of a methodological kind that have come up already are going to need to be taken on board, and that's basically the point of my paper, to draw attention to what these methodological issues are. First point is the notion of taxonomy as such. Now, taxonomies are traditionally encyclopedic. They're not linguistic, and thus they go well beyond the notion of semantics as linguists use the term. I guess the ultimate online encyclopedic experience is intended to be the semantic web. But we should note that semantic here is not our sense of semantic. Semantic web doesn't mean linguistic meaning, it means all knowledge. For instance, the semantic web will, in its anticipated full development in the 23rd century, tell you not just the difference in meaning between, say, a hotel and an inn, which are two HTOED categories, but where the hotels and inns are in your part of the world, or for your next holiday trip, how to get there, whether there's availability, how much rooms cost, and all this sort of thing. Information that does not interest lexicologists in the slightest, unless they're going on holiday, of course. However, semantic taxonomies in the linguist sense, such as Roger and HTOED, rely totally on an encyclopedic perspective. All provide a top-down classification based on knowledge, not semantic relationships. HTOED begins with three very general categories: the external world, the mental world, the social world, and then, as you've seen in Mark's slides, makes increasingly specific subdivisions until editors decide that no further distinctions are worth making. Now, these categories and their subcategories are non-linguistic in character. They're based on real-world criteria, such as biological species or historical periods and geographical divisions, and they're applicable to all languages in principle, and of a special importance, reflecting the mindset of the designer. There's no such thing as a universally recognized logical taxonomy, and any exploration of the HTOED classification needs to bear this in mind. Now, the best way to show that taxonomy mindsets exist is to compare them. For instance, as number 2 on your handout here is Dewey. The Dewey Decimal Classification System, widely used in libraries, isn't it? Differs in many ways from that used in other systems in the HTOED. You see Dewey's top 10 categories in number 2. Number 3, there's a different set of categories that I used. I was developing a taxonomy for online advertising a few years ago, and that's the 10 categories that I used, and you see the differences there. Go into HTOED and you'll see all sorts of further differences too. And as you look down to lower level categorization, the differences multiply. To take just one example, in Dewey, Central America is listed as part of North America. In HTOED, it's grouped along with South America. So where do you put Central America? I mean, no two taxonomies may make the same decision. Thousands of such basic questions have to be decided, and taxonomists make different decisions. Is Greenland a continent? Is Turkey in Europe? Is a tomato a vegetable? Is photography an art? What counts as a craft? Is a satellite a spacecraft? There's inevitably a certain amount of arbitrariness and personal taste in decision-making, and users of any thesaurus need to be aware of it, as it affects where they look and what they will find or not find there. Now, the biggest problem facing anyone using a taxonomy of lexical items is what I'd call missing item syndrome. We go to a particular semantic category and see a listing of synonyms, as Mark's been describing. Only we notice that some of the items we expect to be there are missing. We look in the index and discover that the item is definitely in the database, it's in the thesaurus, but in an associated category, either vertically, that is, higher up or lower down the classification, as with relationships of hypernymy and hyponymy, or horizontally at the same level of classification as with, say, antonymy and incompatibility. Now, this problem affects HTOED as any thesaurus, but in HTOED it's present on an unprecedented scale given the large number of lexical items involved and the historical dimension of the work. Now, I'm not sure how to solve this. I mean, we're not here to solve things today, just present problems, other than by applying some sort of structural, semantic, cognitive model in a stronger way and taking etymology more fully into account. Now, I'm going to illustrate this from just 2 examples from HTOED. First, the problem of vertical categories. Now, in a taxonomy, we normally expect the range of the semantic categories to reduce as we go further down the hierarchy, beginning with X. We expect the next level down to be X1, aspects of X, and the next one down to be X2, aspects of X1, and so on and so forth. But sometimes there's overlap between higher and lower categories, as can be illustrated by the HTOED listing for privy. And this is a diagram based upon the HTOED. At the top, you get the external world, and then you go down to the category of life, and then you go down. That's subdivided into those 3 areas, and then down again, the middle one into sanitation, down again, and you get to the category of privy latrine, with its subdivisions further down. And this is the kind of diagrammatic presentation I'm using in that book I was telling you about. Now, the basic idea behind this classification is the point that the subcategories deal with special cases. So within the general category of privy latrine, we see such special settings as, in a ship, in a convent, the mind boggles, and used by a king, or special pieces of equipment such as urinals and chamber pots and bedpans. Now, the subcategory, water closet lavatory, down at the bottom there, focuses on the room in which the lavatorial facility is situated rather than the facility itself. And sometimes this distinction is clear-cut. There's no ambiguity with words such as restroom or bathroom. One always goes to these places and never sits on them. You go to a restroom, you don't sit on the restroom. But not all the words are like these. For instance, the OED definition of water closet you see in number 4 on your handout. A closet or small room fitted up to serve as a privy. That seems clear enough until we read the usage note, sometimes applied to the pan and the connected apparatus for flushing and discharge, also loosely to any kind of privy. Now, for semanticists and taxonomists, the devil always lies in such details, here in these words, sometimes and loosely. The multiple application of words like water closet, made more complex always by the vagaries of language change and uncertainties over usage, both socially and regionally, means there are bound to be arbitrary decisions over which category to assign a word to. For example, in the HTOED, little house, which has been put in the category of privy latrine, has to be contrasted with smallest room, which has been put into the category water closet lavatory. So two words which you'd think of should go together are actually separated in the taxonomy. Now, how did that happen? Well, it's a matter of your approach. If the taxonomist feels that the bowl plus pedestal, or equivalent, is the dominant element, the word will be assigned to the first category. If it's the room in which the thing is felt to be the dominant element, it'll be assigned to the second. Now, in several instances, everything depends on the context, and even on the choice of grammatical construction, as we see with such entries as lavatory, toilet, loo, and John, which allow both going to and sitting on. You know, I'm going to the John, I'm sitting on the John. You have both. So which category is it going to go into? Into both categories? That's a big issue. The second problem is the problem of horizontal categories. Now, this can be illustrated from the semantic field of stupid, foolish, inadequate person, which is here. At the top, we're now in the mental world, down to mental capacity, into lack of understanding, into stupid, foolish, inadequate person, and eventually into the category of fool. Now, clearly, a semantic distinction can be drawn between the two extremes of blockhead, on the left of the slide there, which is somebody intact, who's got senses intact, who's acting stupidly, and simpleton, somebody with a weak intellect. Fool hovers uncertainly in between the two cases. And when we examine contexts of use, we see exactly this happening. For instance, if you go to the fool list, we would find cases where the etymological story is only partly told. Look up a word like Nigion, N-I-G-I-O-N, in the OED. The entry states equals Nidget, N-I-D-G-E-T, and the cross-reference shows that it's indeed part of the explanation of the word. But Nidget is not in the fool listing. It's one of the divisions of the simpleton category. So Nigion, in the middle there, says look somewhere else for the equals sign, which is in the OED. So this is the sort of problem that we find repeated on many kinds of occasions. There are over 400 items of an extremely colloquial kind in this fool category, and several of them you find yourself darting about between subdivisions in order to get a sense of the picture that Mark was talking about earlier. So I think there's two big issues there, and the third one I've just left on the handout for you because there isn't time to go into it in detail, but traditional taxonomies have never been comprehensive, partly because of the limitations of paper publishing, as we know, and partly because it's impossible to keep the material up to date. Well, one of the things that happened when I was doing this particular study was handling the sheer problems of integration and citation which are around in this exercise. And I'm not going to talk about the fifth item on the handout there. I'm going straight to number 6, where I've just listed cases where this is perhaps one of the biggest, and I don't know how to solve this, the biggest issues facing the whole thing. We assume that the OED, as it is up to the moment, is pretty accurate. And when I was looking at the integration between HTOED and the OED, I did find it was pretty accurate. But in 2.7% of cases, there's nearly 3% of cases, I found errors of integration. And I list what some of them are down on the handout there. The good news is that the vast majority, I checked about 1,500 examples altogether. The good news is that almost all the instances of quotation from authors, I went back to the original texts and found them online and checked the quotation, the citation against the original. In almost all cases, it was accurate. Only in a few cases was it inaccurate. That's the good news. The bad news is that there were 33 cases where there was an error in the dating cross-reference, and I list them there for you to have a reflection about later. My favourite of all of them, and I'll just end on this one, is the very last one. In the category on prostitutes, there is a word pliers. dated 1678, which takes us to Pliers noun. But none of the 10 citations at Pliers have any such figurative illustration. It takes a feat of imagination to use the 1678 quotation in this way, which is a quotation from a book by the globe maker James Moxon called Mechanic Exercises or the Doctrine of Handiworks, who explains, pliers are of two sorts, flat-nosed and round-nosed. Their office is to hold and fasten upon all small work and to fit it into place. This, remember, in the entry on prostitute. These lexicographers have a wicked sense of humour sometimes, don't they? Thank you.
Okay, and now we move on to Janine Bacon, who will be giving us the Dutch perspective.
So good afternoon, and thank you very much to the OED staff for inviting me to give this talk. Before I start, however, I want to make 2 remarks. The title is, what is OED's place in an interlinked world of digital humanities? Well, in trying to answer that question, I just looked at what is any comparable dictionary's place in an interlinked world of digital humanities. I can think of a German counterpart, I can think of a Dutch counterpart, and so on. And secondly, a Dutch perspective, it might sound as if I'm representative for the Dutch. I'm not. There's lots of discussion going on, controversies brought up. So it's my perspective having dealt with Dutch. That's actually how one should interpret it. So as an overview, I'm going to talk about filling a multilingual gap on the web, or the internet, or whatever, just virtual world, linking layers, types of information, the future of past words. As I said this morning, actually the words we are using now will be described in the future as the past. An everlasting cycle of filling gaps, filling the spoken language gaps, linking the world, Englishes. Now there's a lot of gaps in there. And filling the gaps. Now, I don't want you, at least I didn't intend this, I don't want you to interpret filling gaps as filling the leftovers. It's certainly not like that. It's enhancement, it's improvement. There's a huge gap in there, in all of those aspects, not only for English, but at least also for Dutch, for German, and we all try to fill the gaps. So I go to the first one, filling a multilingual gap on the web. Recently, huge amounts of EU and national funding have been gained in order to establish an interlinked infrastructural world, read hardware world, of digital humanities. One example is GLARIN, Common Language Resources and Technology Infrastructure. Presently, much effort is put into a workflow using different tools or software and different resources, data, which are physically decentralized. So we're centralizing in a virtual way what is actually physically decentralized. But what about interlinking the content of the data, especially multilingual lexical data? Now, I must say, when I talk about languages, I'm not only talking about different languages as Dutch, English, German, Italian, but also about languages or the language used in different periods of a language. So Middle Dutch is, for me, a different language than from Modern Dutch. Middle English is a different language than Modern English because, actually, we do not speak Middle English. We have to learn it. We do not speak Italian. We have to learn it. My thoughts concern the linking of the retrieval methods. Remember, retrieval you can only do when it's beforehand analyzed in that way. You can only find what's already there in a specialized way. Of Google, what we call then on the mainland the semasiological way of doing things. In other words, looking for the unknown meaning of a known name or word form, with the content and the way in which the multilingual Wikipedia can be reformalized, namely as a set of characteristic, distinctive semantic features, lending itself for information retrieval based on this onomasiological methods, namely looking for the unknown name or word for a known concept of meaning. Because who actually are we doing this for? When we look from now, 20 years onwards, we're actually doing it for, let's say, Prince George of Cambridge. He's going into school, he's going to be educated, he's going to be a user, hopefully of the OED or something else, but his education will disclosure in the end how he will use the OED or some other dictionary, whether he still will use books or only digital information. And the other one is the computer child being born at this moment, or being constructed at this moment. Because by doing all of this, just see that, by doing all of this, what we can teach that computer child is our knowledge of the world. Teach them the concepts, teach them the definitions, and they will know the word forms. So let's raise Prince George together with Wally III, or something in that order, and see what we can do in the future. The OED, according to me, could then function as a model or a hub. I like the hub-spoke model somehow. As a model or a hub linking to all other languages. That means all other periods of English, but also Dutch, French, Italian, and so on. Languages you can already switch onto in the OED Online. I think that these are preliminary ideas about filling a multilingual gap on the web. Just go into, as I say, the possibilities for human users, for computational users. Use what's already available on the net, and then try to come up with a detection of a gap that can be filled. Linking layers type of information. The OED, together with other comparable dictionaries, could function as a portal or a hub to more scientific, more detailed or specialist data and dictionaries. It would facilitate the lookup function for different types of users and their needs. For example, correct spelling, correct pronunciation, short definitions, examples in written and oral form, diachronic trips into English, and other languages, preferably in written and spoken form. An immediate look-up function from example Google Books, e-books, Kindle, and Google as a search engine could also be a user-friendly expansion. And finally, at a multilingual level, translations both written and spoken and comparisons across languages based on timelines, for example, Old Middle English, Old Middle Dutch, Old Middle High German. The future of passwords. I would really like to see that in the future, selection would no longer function as exclusion. Where do users look up words or multi-word expressions, or whatever we call them, collocations, which do not and did not survive, for example, the 3-year criteria, although those words frequently occur in text written in a certain period? When looking up in all the relevant Dutch dictionaries, every word or word combination of every available and digitized Middle Dutch text, it showed that about 17% of the vocabulary used in those texts, which are now digitized, was not described in the dictionaries. Will that happen again with modern vocabulary, and will it be considered a problem? If so, how are we to solve that problem? How can we and where can we find meanings of words, information of words, descriptions of words and words inspections if we do not do it now? So will we repeat, let's say, the mistake of the past, namely that selection functions as exclusion? An everlasting cycle of filling gaps. So, of course, as long as I was the director of the institute, I had to keep people on working. And I had to convince the finances that lexicography and computational lexicography and dictionary making was still useful and very very worthy to be financed. So you have to create an everlasting cycle of filling the gaps. Well, the Electronic Dutch Language Bank, the Taalbank Nederlands, has integrated all of the ENL dictionaries. In 2010, everything was finished, covering 1,500 years of Dutch, from the beginning of the 6th century to the beginning of the 21st century. The linking was established to the modern spelling of Dutch. It also contains a huge amount of digitized quotations and text covering the same period. In order to find and fill the gaps, a cycle of mapping has been introduced, resulting in lists of words and expressions which were not described in the existing dictionaries. So, in short, you have a corpus of text, you have the dictionary, you map one onto the other, and you just see the gaps. You can describe them, and so on, you go back to the text. In fact, as more historical texts become available in digital OCR form every day, the Impact project, for example, is a good example of it. It's improving access to historical text. The more work for the lexicographers. And recently, in 2013, a new EU project started, the name of Transcriptorium, and that one will deal with the digitization of handwritten texts. Not printed text, but handwritten text, resulting in even more data and resources, all to be dealt with by lexicographers, as I said, an everlasting cycle of filling the gaps of the past and the future. Now, filling the spoken language gap, through the OED timeline, visually presented online, users can follow the upcoming and decline of words, their changes in meaning, the changes and varieties in spelling, and so on. Would it be worth the effort to introduce two more types of information? Namely, on the one hand, a monolingual oral component, how did the English past sound? For entries and examples, not only for words, but expounding on it. And on the other hand, interlinking different languages in order to listen to the how would Europe in the past have sounded. Linking the word Englishes, a term I learned recently. For decades, modern Dutch has used words that sound English, but are not used by English native speakers as such. A few examples are parking, where you put your car. A smoking is some dress, well, some suit for a man. And more recently, as I read in one of the abstracts, computer terminology as notebook. Also, German speakers seem to have developed the same habit. They talk about handy. Okay, handy has a meaning in English, but not the meaning it has in Dutch. Smoking has a meaning in English, but not the same one as it has in Dutch. OED, for example, could invite other non-English dictionaries to establish links to all of their English word forms that have different meanings for native English speakers, therefore extending, in a right or wrong way, the word Englishes. So this is actually everything I have to say to you about what I think could be done for the OED, but also for others. And I think there's a great future, and I hope I could convince you of that, a great future for any big dictionary as the OED's place in an interlinked world of digital humanities, just filling the gaps. Thank you.
A coffee break. So our respondent is Tok Kosem, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Lynn. So I was entrusted with this role only a couple of days ago, and I was honored on one hand and also a bit daunted on the other. And I think it was lucky that I was invited to be a respondent in this session, because I was planning to come anyway, and I was expecting an interested discussion. So I hope I can start off a good discussion with my responses. Now I plan to focus on some of the things that are more general to what the presenters have been saying. Namely, I see three sort of topics that are being addressed here, which one is the way the data is organized and visualized or presented within the OED database, and then also how is that data combined with other external resources, whether there are projects that are going parallel with the OED, with their knowledge or without. And then thirdly, the data where there's an initiative to introduce a new link with the OED, such as multilingual data. So I would first address the data organization and presentation the way that Mark presented it. And I have to say that in terms of alphabetical order, I don't find it really problematic, because I think with online dictionaries that goes away in any respect, because the users no longer think that way. Now, with regards to the alphabetic ordering on the right-hand side, I think some researchers would still argue it's useful, mainly because you see the derivatives of words, and you can explore, for example, you can see which words are missing in the OED. So it's a way of, if the OED were to decide to introduce crowdsourcing or anything like that, it would be a way to observe which words are still missing next to or preceding or following the word that the user would look up. And semantic tagging is something that's quite sounds like an appealing option to me. That's I've been working with automatic extraction of examples from corpora for the purposes of devising a dictionary of contemporary Slovene, and there have been promising results. And the only caveat I would say here is that I think it was mentioned that the examples would be extracted from the resources directly. And in my experience, I think there's still a need for lexicographers at sort of intervention before the data can be directly presented to the user, especially if we're talking about the OED. Now, the visualization, I think I was looking forward to David McCandless being here, because I'm always eager to hear people who are not linguists speaking about solutions on how to visualize words and meanings. And I think an attempt shown by Mark is one step in such direction. And the only thing I'm always worried about is how do you explain that to the user? And where is the line between putting too much demand on the user to interpret such the data that's visualized in that manner? I think the current solutions of showing graphs and similar ways of visualizing the data in the OED are quite appropriate, and there's definitely more room to explore that further. Now, I'm probably not the right person to speak about historical thesaurus and sort of any more errors if there are, but there's only there is one thing that that should be pointed out here, is that I spoke to Mark about this today, that as far as I understand, there's no linkage between the OED database and the historical thesaurus database. And I think it's a shame if such projects there's not more collaboration on such projects also when the OED is being updated. So that's something that if any database also in the future is being made, perhaps a way of solving that would be that the OED, for example, gives a bit more insight into the database and the idea of how that could be used. And I think this relates to the multilingual resources as well. there were many points made by Janine, and I feel quite strongly that the OED website should really be left alone in terms of, I would say that integrating multilingual resources should be done on a separate portal somewhere else. I think it's just I don't know how the regular users of the OED would perceive sort of any extra information on the website. So I see that as a way of integrating the OED data into another source. And I think this was also discussed during the previous session. I think how could the OED be used in the future? And I think one way is to use the OED as it is, the database being available to the researchers. And then there's also this a way of using snippets of the OED data and making it available for other purposes. And when we come to discuss, I think that will be done in the next session. So what other forms can the OED appear in? So be it on mobile phones or elsewhere. I think the solution is perhaps not to think about putting all the OED in, but being a bit selective and say, this will satisfy the needs of this particular user, and so forth. And I think, oh, okay, the last bit, just to finish. The future of past words, this was one of the things that caught my attention. I think what Janine said about including more words in, not necessarily waiting that 10-year period of word being current to warrant an inclusion in the OED. I think even the editors of the OED already admitted that this should not be a strict rule. And I think tweet was already included on the basis of that. So I would second that to think about this policy and making it a bit more loose. And I would conclude with that. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so as part of the discussion, I think people should feel free not only to ask questions and make comments on the presentations that have been given here, but also to raise other issues related to the notion of digital humanities and the use of the OED or contributions to the OED. So who would like to speak? And can I remind you to wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation, please.
Hans-Jörg Schmid, Munich University. I'm just making a comment, I guess, about what David told us about problems in the thesaurus. I think there are limits, and the limits are concern the way we can create ontologies that are fixed and rigid, but that are targeted to map the structure of our mind. That's basically what the thesaurus is doing, and our mind is much more flexible, it's influenced by context, it's primed by context, and the thesaurus cannot be flexible and dynamic that way. Also, our mind is based on so many kinds of association, links and relations, that the taxonomic relation is just one of them. You mentioned all the examples of, part-whole relations, all kinds of things that trigger associations to other fields. There's this, that's just one issue. The other issue is what is the gain? I remember this passage from John Lyon's dissertation, I think, from 1963, where he talks about the principle of diminishing returns. And what is the gain of increasing granularity if you don't get additional insight? So it might be an idea to restrict your hierarchy to a number of key levels and not go any further at some point where you raise more questions than you provide answers, basically. Thank you.
I think one of the points there is you can't, once you've got a taxonomy in place, it's pretty rigid. You can't sort of present it with fuzzy boundaries or anything of that kind. But the user is flexible, as you say. So I think that the only practical point that came out of my comments is this, that one has to advise users that when they're looking up a particular category and looking for a word in a particular category, they must remember to look up vertically, up and down vertically, and side to side horizontally, in order to get a complete sense of the semantic field that they're wanting to explore. Don't just stick to the category that immediately jumps up at you. Remember to look sideways and in the other direction. And then you'll get a sense of the word set surrounding the item that you're exploring. So the flexibility has got to be, they've got to be reminded to be flexible, if you like. I think the biggest fallacy is for somebody to think that the only words in a semantic field are the words that are going to come up in one of Mark's categories. Well, you know, that's a minimalist view of the category. There are also these structurally semantic relations around which also need to be taken into account.
Do you want to?
No, not really, David, at all. If you look at the Glasgow version of the database online, we can force users to go up and down and left and right. We highlight that as much as possible because they kind of exist. I kind of agree with you that when you get to the really nitty-gritty, that's tricky. It's very handy. Sometimes that's the easiest stuff to do when you're sitting kind of saying this is a type of graph and this is a type of equation. That's easy enough to kind of divide up. But when you're aggregating or when you're looking at bigger patterns, you are better kind of stopping at round about level 4, possibly level 5, which are levels at approximately human scale, as you know, Vaconi and Turner would have it. They're round about there, exists our kind of base category for that. And everything else is just if you like, a sort of, you know, a deviation from that basic scale, either to over-specificity or over-generalization. Any hierarchy will have, you know, a core scale and then over-specificity and over-detail. And if you just sort of gravitate towards the middle, as with everything in life, you tend to do all right.
Do you want? Okay, thank you. My name is Philippe Clément from IDM. Maybe a few comments. I'm completely sharing your views, Mark, about alphabetical order. I think we should state very clearly that alphabetical order fitted the printed format, doesn't fit at all the digital format. And it is, I think it is an important thing. And we can simply say, okay, our colleagues from 100, 200 years ago have been very intelligent. They find the right way to present the information. They've been very good at adapting effectively what they want to say about the words and the meanings. And they say, okay, they find it was the perfect match or the perfect fit. But today is a different case. And I'm completely sharing these views that obviously we shouldn't be radical, but in fact we should also express radical views so that it is well understood, or at least well taken, sorry. And I'm in complete disagreement with our colleague here, so that today we cannot split the OED in smaller chunks. We need, I mean, it doesn't make any sense in our views when you look at how Google works. Wikipedia, we had this morning very good comments about this. We don't want to split. We want to put more. It is exactly the contrary we are willing to do. Because splitting, selecting, under which criteria, to be honest? What will be the driving argument to make that decision? We want to make the things available and fluid, as it's been said also this morning about the access. So that's a second comment. And maybe a third comment, and thank you very much, Janine, to what you said, because as a foreigner, the non-native English speaker, I feel the same about a number of words. And effectively, there are a number of words. It would be very interesting that they are defined or how they are used in other languages. But for me, the question, and that question was raised too in this morning session in the Lancaster room, the question is, okay, what are the boundaries of the dictionary, to be honest? What are the boundaries of the OED dictionary today? So that, and what English, you said word English is, but should we say word English is plus plus plus, because multilingual is not maybe the right word, because multilingual refers immediately to bilinguals, different languages, different nations, different organizations, when what we need is really a tool which will be available worldwide, so that everybody will access that tool, and not everybody is native speaker, English speaker. So it is very important that everybody feels comfortable, and not in a given category, such as, well, I'm not a native speaker. Oh. So that's the point, and I think that the point you made is very good, because effectively we do use the words, and that works in various senses. Because in France, for instance, we have that awful commission which is saying what is good or not good in French. But the impact is that it's extremely restrictive, and it simply limits the evolution and the promotion of the language. So thank you. I've been too long. Thank you very much.
Any response?
Just a comment on that. I mean, when you think of the statistics of global English use, I mean, your point is so important. I mean, for every one native speaker in the world, there are now 5 non-native speakers. And when you actually look at the dictionaries of local regional English that have evolved around the world, like the Dictionary of South African English, for example, which has got 10,000 items in it or more, or the Dictionary of Jamaican English, which has got 15,000 items in it or more. And you look at all these local dictionaries, most of which don't have their data incorporated into the OED as it is at present, and yet the stuff is out there. And then that's all the, as it were, former colonial nations that were into this business fairly early on. But we do actually go around and look at the English that is emerging in all countries in the world, like France and Germany and the Netherlands and so on. And if you do a kind of cultural analysis of the English that is being used there, you find that you're talking about, similarly, several thousand items. If I can just, because of the rush earlier on, I wasn't able to refer to item 5 on the handout, where I listed some of the culturally specific items that you get in British English. Where were they? Things like, you know, it was like Clapham Junction in there. Now, we all know what that means if you're a sort of British, culturally aware native speaker. My watch is more Portobello Road than Bond Street. We know what that means, again, if you know the cultural background, and you can see the other examples there. Now, my point is that when I've been around the world and talking in English to people, teachers and others in France or Germany or wherever, they have their equivalents to Clapham Junction and Portobello Road and so on, which don't get into their dictionaries any more than Tunbridge Wells, as it were, would get into our dictionaries. And that's where this distinctiveness builds up. It's not just examples like handy and smoking, which there are a few dozen of, obviously. Mm-hmm. There are thousands of these expressions that need to be incorporated into a more encyclopedically aware dictionary. And this is essentially the thrust of my intervention, and that is that and it's been forced upon us by the thesaurus, you see, because the thesaurus being an encyclopedically orientated enterprise and the dictionary being a linguistically orientated enterprise, how do you bring these two things together? And you do so by, I think, by making the thesaurus more linguistic, which is being done because of the structural semantic relations there, and by making the dictionary more encyclopedic, which hasn't, on the whole, been done in British dictionaries, but much more likely to have been done in American ones, who used to American dictionaries put people and places in quite a lot. The British dictionaries never have. And this is the kind of thing that as English becomes global, more and more of this encyclopedic stuff is going to come out of these different countries and are going to have to be incorporated into the databases somehow.
Well, that's exactly the point I wanted to make, that indeed that you have to be more encyclopedic or more thesaurus-like. Because whether you like it or not, as I said, our world knowledge we share. Not to the specific detailed levels, that's why also the different layers, but we share that. And I must admit, in preparation for this talk, I took some definitions out of the latest modern Dutch dictionary, and I typed it in on the web on Google Translate. And it were nice translations, so I got one definition translated into the other, and actually I was looking up horse, the definition of horse in Dutch. I looked up via Google Translate, it translated it for me, and looked itself for the word, so there I was, horse. I typed in the definition, I got the English equivalent, although my definition really was just in Dutch, and it wasn't a definition I made myself, by the way. I borrowed it, and it did it for me, and there I was. So, and this is indeed, I think, some way of dealing, and also for computer education, if I may use the word, the education of a computer, not by computer, to say, this is, you know, what we know, these are the concepts, a bit here, a bit there. The examples might be different, culturally dependent, but this is the knowledge, and we can just go from one language to another. And as I said, we can do the same within different periods of English. We tried the same, we try an equivalent example of Dutch. We looked up someone who has something to do with meat, either sell it or cut it apart or something, a butcher, in other words. So this was the definition. Then we looked it up throughout the Dutch, and we had about 7, 8 words, 6 of which I never heard of, because they were 15th century, 13th century, and so on. So also my own language, or the different periods of my language, are foreign language to me, and by using this tool, I can just look it up. Oops. I could just look it up, and without any mistake, and I can even translate it. I can even look it up in Old English if I want, and even listen to what it sounded in Old English. So I just see a bright future, let's say.
This is exciting stuff, the multilingual aspect and English as a lingua franca. And when I was asked to respond to the panel that I responded to, I started thinking, and at some point I came to the English as a lingua franca aspect, and I brought some of those German English examples, of which there are thousands, since it's amazing. And some of them, I'm waiting for them to be loaned back into English, because they are already. I mean, if you look at the global international English, there's lots of things there that are not English. And so the question is, when will the OED open the floodgates? Should they? The one thing that I would like to ask, though, is that once you include world Englishes, do not separate the outer from the expanding circles, meaning the former colonies and the non-colonies, so Euro-English or whatever. Do not do that. Do not replicate the quirk-catch-through debate from the 1980s. Do not go there. Make it all smaller, but treat Euro-English on the same level as Philippine English. That's my
absolutely
one request.
Totally agree with that. That three-circle model is past its sell-by date now. And it's statistics that have made it past that sell-by date. I mean, there was a time when the vast majority of English speakers around the world were either native speakers or sort of colonial territory speakers. Well, that's no longer the case. There are more English speakers in China these days probably than in any other country, though we don't know for sure. And there's a huge amount of, you know, cultural Chinese English out there. Not the stuff you see in the cartoons of people getting Chinese English wrong, you know, that kind of funny stuff. No, I mean serious cultural stuff to do with China, which Chinese people talking English in China would automatically use without a second thought, and is in no dictionary anywhere in the world. A lot of it's encyclopedic, a lot of it isn't. When you were talking, Janine, I'm reminded of my last visit to the Netherlands, where I encountered the most important concept that's come out of the Netherlands in 1,000 years, which is the concept of the apple flap. Now, if you don't know what an apple flap is, you need to know. It's the most wonderful creation, cookery creation. It's a mixture of pastry and apple, and it's to die for. Now, people talk about, when we're talking about this in the Netherlands with a group of English people, I mean, it's the frequency with which that word turns up is amazing. But you won't find it in the OED, of course, and you won't find it in a Dutch English dictionary either, because, you know, the Dutch don't think to put it in. It's just every day for them. But for me, the first time I encountered the word apple, I had no idea what it meant. And I had to ask native speakers in order to find out. Now, multiply that example by thousands, and you see the extent of the problem. You often find yourself in a foreign country talking to a group of people, and they're all talking English, and they're all from that country, and you suddenly realize, you know, although you've understood every word individually, apart from a few, and every grammatical construction, and the pronunciation is fine, you don't know what the hell they're talking about, because you don't share the cultural background of the people, and there's nowhere to look it up. So this is, as it were, bringing in Brewer and all the other culturally aware things that are out there, integrating them into the system. So back to your point, you know, divisions are hopeless here. You want to bring everything in order to get a sense of where we are.
I'd just like to make a comment about things like handy. It seems that if when it's being used in a German context, it's no longer an English word, actually. And it's for the Germans to define that. And if we get it back from the Germans in another form, then it's for us to define it. And that we need to be very careful because we're winding up with a dictionary, imagining a dictionary of all languages, perhaps, where there are no borders at all. If it's going to be done, you know, nobody's been touching actually on the logistics of a lot of these. A few people have, you know, the money that it would cost, but to be practical, we have to have some boundaries. That's one reason that they avoided encyclopedic information, particularly in the English dictionaries. And Webster's found that when they were going from Webster's 2 to Webster's 3, they had to cut out a lot of their encyclopedic information, which, you know, easily goes out of date and is in need of, you know, much more attentive revision sooner than lexicographical information. So Gove was actually, you know, moving more toward the OED than the older Websters. There's a place for the encyclopedic, but it's something like Wikipedia, perhaps, and maybe with links that we could get out. Anyway, that's all.
Well, the examples brought up by people in Germany who conceive the word handy as English. Therefore, they looked it up in the OED, because it sounded English, to find out that actually it was English, but with a completely different meaning. So the suggestion is not to incorporate it in the English dictionary, because it is not English in that meaning, but to link or refer to English-sounding words that the users of that language might conceive as English, to help them out and say, no, you can find it, but not with us, it's in your own dictionary and it sounds English. Because another example or a tradition in Belgium is that we use a lot of French words, but when speaking that in France, they don't understand us. So it sounds French, but actually it isn't French. So for a user, as a pupil at school, they might think, okay, I look it up in French dictionary, oh, it's not there. So that was the problem actually I was addressing for the users of non-native English speakers.
We have to be real about what these users are like too. I mean, there's a naive conception of bilingualism around that, you know, the bilingual has his two languages separate from each other. It's not like that at all. Bilingualism is a real mix. There's so much code switching that's going on. Stop a bilingual in the middle of a sentence and say, which language were you just talking? They often say, I don't know. In there, it's all mixed up. So there isn't an easy answer to the question, is the word you just used in one language or the other? The answer for the real bilingual person is, I have no idea, and it doesn't matter anymore. So the problem for the lexicographer is how you handle that kind of fuzzy edge to the system. And the only way I can see is that you include as much as possible.
Maybe I could come in with a question. What's interesting to me about the thesaurus, and I understand it was started a long time ago, but in this digital age, that it is a hierarchical thing and not a word net.
Yeah.
Is there any chance of that changing?
No. I suppose the first answer. It started in '63. It took 44 years to build it in the hierarchy it's in. So we have 797,000 sentences arranged in 236,000 semantic categories. So then to make those categories into a net would then probably kill us. One thing I would say is, though, there's lots of cross-references which are possible. We're currently building a database of all the lexical metaphors we know of in English, all areas where there's lexical overlap between disparate semantic categories, which indicate a metaphorical connection. And that should be ready in about a year's time. And that's one way of integrating cross-references between two areas, you know, between space and time, for example. If you're talking about space, if you're talking about time, you often talk about space. And so a cross-reference from there to another place. So that's probably part way towards becoming a network. My problem is I really dislike semantic networks. I've never really found them to be, they superficially appear to resemble better how we construct the world, but only superficially. In some ways I almost like what Hans-Jörg was talking about, the sort of artificiality of the hierarchy. At least it's clear that it's artificial. That no claims are being made as to this is how knowledge is stored in the mind, because that would be futile. There'd be no point in doing it. And sometimes network models which attempt to go towards that just end up being sort of pseudo in every sense of that bound morpheme.
I think this is the biggest challenge facing cognitive semantics, actually, is how you bring together those two worlds, the encyclopedic world and the semantic. You see, the trouble with the word semantic, as Mark's just been using it, and I find, as I was mentioning in my paper, is semantic has these two meanings. On the one hand, it means a kind of encyclopedic. I mean, so many of the categories in the thesaurus are simply encyclopedic categories, you know, biological species and things like that. Nothing specifically linguistic about them at all, except that this just happens to be, the words often have a sort of one-to-one relationship with the cognitive category. But there are lots of other areas where there isn't a clear relationship between the cognitive category on the one hand and the linguistic category on the other. And so you get this, you know, what is semantic and what is not. I think this is the biggest challenge we've got, is how you bring these things together. I think it's well worth exploring. There isn't actually that much structural semantics in the thesaurus, is there, Mark? No. Really? I mean, you've got some antonyms and things here and there, but a complete structural semantic analysis of the lexicon, and there's certainly nothing in the OED either. So, you know, this is a big interface that remains to be done, seems to me.
I think so, but one of the problems is, I mean, Lynn can probably talk about this better than I could, but the problem with semantic relations, when you're actually sitting with 787,000 slips of paper from the OED to categorise, yes, is you just cannot decide what a semantic relationship is. I mean, there's the traditional problem with, you know, opposites and antonyms, you know, kind of this drunken antonym of sober in the same way that, you know, up is an antonym of down, and that kind of relationship. And then the more you go into it and the more you try to get to do it, or the more you kind of try case studies, you realise that the relationships between lexical items and categories are so complex that you're almost back down to the one-to-one relationship you have in the hierarchy anyway. When you're saying this is we have terms like generic antecedent. I mean, what is the relationship between poverty and lessness? Just general lessness. And in what instances, I mean, are these instantiations of others? Or are they relationships in their own right? Or are they... it just gets messy. So you're better just kind of ignoring that kind of thing. And of course, part of the problem with 44 years is every time you try and do anything, then a new flavour of semantics comes along. I mean, I looked at old materials in the thesaurus database from when, obviously long before I joined, and it refers to theories and approaches which were rejected, which now I don't even think anyone in this room would remember. It just happens that way over and over again. We found we were doing prototype semantics about 10 years before Eleanor Roche published stuff on prototype semantics. That was how we just arranged these words naturally. So we've tried to be theory neutral, although we're aware that being theory neutral is a theoretical position in its own right. So.
Okay. I think we have time for one more, and I think Mark had his hand up first.
Thanks. I've heard a lot of insightful and fascinating things about lexicography in this session. But over the last little while, back in the United States, Stanley Fish has published a series of quite hostile and dismissive columns about digital humanities and what a useless waste of time and money and general intellectual fraud it is. And I have to say that I didn't hear anything in this session that would provide much of an answer to him, because he's not arguing that there's anything wrong with lexicography. I think he's fine with lexicographers. He just doesn't want any of them in his English department. So, you know, in order to make a case for the broader application, the broader world, for integration with the broader world of digital humanities, there would have to be something said, I think, about relationships to literary analysis, to style, to register, to genre, to character, to metaphor. Well, we've heard something about metaphor, but I mean metaphor in the sense that literary analyst would
all Stanley has to do is try and write a historical novel based in the 17th century and make sure that all his words are accurate and not anachronisms, and he'll quickly find that his intuition lets him down, and he's going to be searching for an application that will do the job for him, and he'll end up in the HDOED.
Oh, well, so I don't think if he were here, I mean, I'm not very sympathetic with Stanley Fish in general.
No,
if I can try channeling him for the moment, if he were here, I think he would say that that's just fine, and that he's also highly indebted to the people who you know, the chemists who formulate ink, and the people who turn trees into paper. But again, he doesn't want them in his department. And so I think that it's...
He doesn't want plumbers in his department either, but when his water system goes wrong, he calls them in.
Exactly, but I think there is a case, I think there is an issue, there is a lot of, actually, in my opinion, interesting work going on, applying things that we've heard about in this session and elsewhere during this day, in things that people like Stanley Fish, leaving him aside, would recognize as being within their charter.
I think that's a fair point, that we have been discussing digital lexicography more than we've been discussing digital humanities here. And one thing that David sent us before this session, when I asked for people to send us things to read about this, was an interesting article by Charlotte Brewer about how recent changes in the OED's user interface have made it less useful to scholars who want to trace how ideas have been represented by dictionaries, which is a very interesting way to look at the history of ideas, and that we've lost out on some of that information in the current thing.
Absolutely crucial, Lynn. Yeah, absolutely crucial. With all this talk about change and getting things done and moving forward, it's so important for the management of the dictionary to keep a meticulous record of the archive stages through which the dictionary has been moving. Charlotte's point is that in the last 10 years, a lot of that information, changes have been made, and it's no longer possible, as it were, to reconstruct how dictionary writers saw the world in, say, the year 2000. It sort of got lost somehow, and we need to remember that somebody one day will want to know the answer to that kind of question. So archiving, explicit archiving is essential. It's a basic point, isn't it, really?
Okay. Well, I think we've run out of time, but I hope we can continue this over the coffee break. So thank you very much.